I'm so happy to have you here in this show. And I'm very grateful that you spend time with me because you have such a beautiful message to share. You have such a beautiful book. And just before we talked together a little bit, I said to Mark, it is so cool when you get a book and when you read it and when you finish it and you think, wow, it contains so much wisdom that you want to read it again, you want to go through it again, you want to, earmark it, and there's so much wisdom in that. So I can tell that you must have been working for quite a while on this book, or is this something that just exploded from your soul?
Well, thank you, first off, for your kind words. I feel that as I have gotten older and been kind of swimming in this river for a long time, um, I feel like, and I share this because it's not just for a writer, but I feel this is a metaphor for life. I feel like or our call is to keep swimming and letting the river of experience, and therefore the river of spirit, move through our heart the way water moves through the gill of a fish, and really committed to that depth of being. Then the books become the trail of what passes through. It really becomes a trail of being as honest and as tender as possible and as truthful, knowing that nobody knows how to do this. I think we're meant to find each other and figure out what we're doing, and nobody arrives with an instruction manual. The things that matter, we're just comparing notes on what it is to be alive. Yeah, to be so fully present.
Yeah. Well, and I can truly sense that when reading the book, I feel like you were talking about the flow in the river. I can feel the flow because nothing is static, of course, in life. And what I feel also is that it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel sometimes maybe remorseful or have regrets or whatever it is. And it's part of life. We don't know what you say. But what I found beautiful, like the title, The One Life That We Were Given, but the subtitle, Finding the Wisdom That Waits in Your Heart. Often we have the tendency to search, of course, outside. And we do that all the time. You and I do that. Everybody, listeners do that. What is that wisdom that waits in our heart, and how do we tap into that?
Well, and of course, just as we've said, I could just share some notes along the way, but I don't have any answers. But, even let's take the title for a minute, because I arrived at that after a long time of learning and being, and that we are given this one life, and by facing what it is we're given through the life of relationship, by working with what we're given, um, then what passes through us opens us up, and we discover that we've had what we've been looking for all along. Ramana Maharshi, the great Hindu sage, he said one of the great paradoxes of life is that we keep seeking reality even though we are reality.
Yeah.
And there's a perfect balance here between being and becoming. We live in such an out of balance world that we rightfully have been emphasizing in the last 20, 25 years so much on being. Well, it's not to say that we don't become. It's like you have two legs and you need both to walk,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have to balance it. And so sometimes by standing still or being still, we can access that wisdom that's in our heart, which basically says to us, you are whole as you are. You have everything. You need to engage it and enlighten it, and bring the light in out. Um, and I think that what happens is we have to keep engaged, which sometimes means moving and sometimes means being still, but mostly it means caring.
Yeah.
Mostly it means caring.
Yeah.
It was Plato who said we're born whole, W-H-O-L-E, but we need each other to be complete.
Yeah.
And in the Jewish tradition, it's talked about, all the traditions speak of this, but in different ways. In the Jewish tradition, God, or that sense of divinity, is known as an indwelling presence. And only through relationship and dialogue does that indwelling presence show itself. Only through what we're doing now does that wisdom in our heart show itself. So a metaphor that has become dear to me is of a simple, and most of the teachers are very simple, but they show so much, a simple wooden match that you might light a fire with. So we all know when we hold that match that the light is dormant in the tip of that match. But it doesn't reveal itself until it is struck against some surface in the world. And so I would say to you that the teacher of that little match is that so too are gifts. Our gifts, like the light in that match, they're there, like the wisdom in our heart, and they remain dormant until we strike our gifts against the needs of the world.
Yeah.
And then our light shows itself.
That's
Wow.
beautiful. That's beautiful. And I'm sure that also the readers and listeners who have seen the movie The Power of the Heart can relate to that analogy. Because you use that analogy when the match strikes against experience, you say in the movie, where it's so true. And I'm very always connected with nature, and I go out and I see a beautiful flower, and we were talking about the wholeness. Of course, the flower is whole, but when you see the flower in a beautiful field of flowers, and you see the tapestry of their colors, and everything seems to become even more alive.
Well, and this is a great way. Let's stay with that a little bit, because that's a beautiful teacher there, because in terms of being and becoming, because who knows what flowers think or in what way they think, but they're growing. They're putting down roots and they're sending out sprouts, and maybe they think they're going somewhere. Who knows? But what happens is they put their roots deep into the earth, and at the same time they are sprouting. And then they blossom right where they are. Yeah. Right where they are. Yeah. And I think over time, over the lifetime of a flower, well, compare that to the lifetime of a person. We're putting down roots, and we're sprouting, and we're doing all of this. And often we need to have dreams and goals and ambitions to help us root and sprout. But in the end, we shed all that, and we blossom right where we are. We blossom right where we are. It's very humbling and beautiful.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I was once speaking with Muji, and he says, life is, or to the truth. He was speaking about the truth, and he said the truth is so simple, yet the seeker of truth is often complex. and I like that, because it's true. Because we are so proud of our intellect, and we are so proud of creating things, and we know we're good at that as humans, but sometimes we just go beyond what is right in front of our face.
Well, another let me share a little story. This is from my book of stories, As Far as the Heart Can See, and because it touches on this this kind of work of being and becoming at once, and being humbled that we don't know where we're going. Mm-hmm. We don't know, and in fact, it's better if we don't. But we often have to have something to look toward as it unfolds. So this is a story about a bicyclist who was really training very, very hard to, be in a very professional race like the Tour de France or something like that, and he's done everything. I mean, he's shaved all the hair on his body so he has very little resistance, and he has a great bike, and and he's trained. And then finally the day of the race comes, and they're off. And as they move through the countryside, he is so far ahead at one point that as he comes down the hill into a valley, for a little while, you can't even see the other racers. And as he comes to the bottom of the hill, just then, a great blue heron sweeps over his handlebars with its wings totally outspread. And he's stopped, he's stunned. He straddles his bike because the heron has opened something he's been chasing. And and the other racers are catching up, and he's standing there, not sure what to do or how to get back into the race. And now we stop and we go to years later, and you find him on the back porch of where he lives, and he's looking out into a field. And once in a while, if you ask him, you say, "What cost you the race?" He might turn and he'll say to you, "I didn't lose the race. I left it. I left it."
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, yeah. I was recently speaking with somebody who is training also a lot, and she's running a lot. And actually, she had some personal issues, so we were going through that. And I said, "Well, I have the feeling sometimes that you might run away. You're running away from yourself." And then she started crying, and she said, "That's so true." And sometimes we try to push ourselves so hard not to be willing to feel and to see whatever we have to go
Absolutely.
through.
And one of the other kind of teachings for me, and I talk about these things, because, and pause for a second, I feel like I retrieve my work rather than author it. My all in it. It certainly has some aspect of me, but I feel like I retrieve these things and they become my teachers. And so, retrieving this story and being with it for a while, I started to be with it more deeply. And, someone could say to you, "Well, that's a very nice story and it's very poetic, but he did lose the race. He didn't win." And see, in the teaching of the story, I hold it differently. I feel that he thought he was training to win the race. He was training to meet the heron, which changed his life. But if you would have told him he was training to meet a heron, he probably wouldn't have trained.
No, no. And the profound moment of insight that can change your life in an instant.
So this is this paradoxical relationship between being and becoming. It was important for him to train so he could meet the heron, but he didn't know that was going to happen. So I feel like we're humbly asked to hold what we work toward lightly as kindling for a fire of aliveness that we don't yet know is going to show itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I really like the approach because that's how I perceive life. And of course, I'm not 20 anymore, so you look at life in a little different way. That's the advantage. I remember that my mom always, I saw her growing older, and she said, "Dirk, every year that I get a bit older, life becomes more interesting." And I always was thinking, well, I don't know what she means. I saw her growing older, but I get it now. So I can truly resonate also to the analogy that you just gave. Yeah. So you write now this beautiful book. It's your latest book. The one life that we're given. Um, what is it? What made you decide to write this book, and what do you hope that readers will take from it?
Well, I think, my hope is that I feel like this is an exploration in the relationship between effort and grace. And I feel that, and I really have started the book. I lost my father 3 years ago. He was 93, and he was a master woodworker. And we didn't really speak the same language, though he was a huge creative force unto himself. And I feel like I learned a lot about not knowing that I was learning, and I don't think he knew he was teaching, but watching him. And now that he's gone, he's so present with me. And, I start by talking, which is why there's a beautiful wood shaving on the cover. Is because,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, he taught me, I remember I start the book by talking about, he taught me how to use a chisel when I was a boy. And how that care and that effort would shave off, a small piece of the surface of the wood, and it shows the inner grain. And then he would rub the inner grain that was revealed, and then he'd hold that little shaving and drop it, and we'd watch it float to the floor. And I felt now, all these years later, at the time, of course, I was a kid. I was just, kind of transfixed by it all. But that's we're the wood, and life carves us. We're shaped by life. And the thin pieces that come off are the insight, and that's the grace that teaches us how to float. How to float. Just, amazing. And I learned after all this time, and I didn't realize it then, but, he was a very, he wasn't one that really understood metaphor. He was a very hands-on, embodied craftsman, and he gets a poet for a son, and so I remember now, all these years later, that he would work in his basement in our little home, and he had all big workbench, and he had vices everywhere. I talk about this in the very beginning. And so he would work on like 6 projects at once, and he'd glue something, and then he'd go over here and chisel something, and he'd go put something together. And now, all these years later, that's how I work on books. I've always worked on more than one book at a time, and they kind of cross-pollinate. They're speaking all at the same time. And then at some point, one of the books, like this one, says, now, you need to spend all your time with me now, until this is birthed, until this is finished. And so I think that, one of the big things that I hope for my readers is that something in this journey, and my story is an example, not an instruction. So it's not a how-to, it's sharing what I've learned from life, because my journey is the only thing I can speak through, but my journey is not. It's to open everyone to their own journey. So I'm hopeful that by being honest and truthful, that it may stir every reader to discover their own gifts and their own wisdom.
Yeah.
And to lighten what they carry, maybe a little.
And it reminds me also of, I love the beautiful expression, like we all walk each other home. And I get very much that feeling when I read your stories, your analogies, and that's exactly how it feels.
No, thank you.
Yeah. So you talk about grace, you talk about balance, but especially when we are being what you called knocked off our horse. What does it take, to find our way? How do we cope with that?
Well, I think, and again, I don't always know. I could share what I feel today and walk out the door and get knocked off my horse again, yet again. And but I think there's a twin call here. One is, how do we endure what comes our way? How do we help each other be broken open and not just broken? And at the same time, because it's very natural when we are knocked off our horse, it's very natural to get tight, to pull in. And so this raises, 2 things here. One is that often by being knocked off our horse, we lose our map, and now we have to rely on our direct experience, even if we made a deer map, and we need to find our way by losing our way, which sounds like a paradox. But this has very much been my experience in life, that where I think I'm going is only kindling for the fire of aliveness that's finally lit. And I use examples in that chapter, Knocked Off Your Horse. One of the great kind of archetypal examples is the great disciple of Jesus, Paul, St. Paul, who, the story of St. Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, and he was a vehement, he pursued early Christians to persecute them. And then he was blinded by a light, the story goes, for 3 days in the desert, and was literally knocked off his horse, and then was turned around and became the very thing he was persecuting, was uncovered in him. And now he was the voice of Jesus. And not, this is not to land on any one tradition, because these things represent, Jesus in this story to me represents the inner light that we all carry. And whatever we might do, whatever we might go, we've had look at to be careful what you so easily want to condemn, because you will become it. It's not by accident that in modern times, in America in the last 20 years or so, and with all that's happened with gay rights and gay marriage, and beautifully so, and there have been dozens of members of Congress and people in public life who were like Saul. They were vehemently opposed, condemning gay life and gay love, only to discover that either they themselves were gay or that they had children who were gay, and now they were forced to find that wisdom in their own heart and say, "Oh, love is love." Yeah. And we don't know until this is why it's so important to stay personal, because I believe that things are only abstract if we don't personalize them.
Yeah.
Nothing is really abstract. Nothing. Not Einstein's theory of relativity. Nothing. It's once we personalize them, they become very real. And I think that's part of our job with the one life we're given, is to lean in, and this brings us to one of the main themes of the book, is loving whatever you do. Loving whatever you do. And it's fascinating. I know you've read some of this, but I talk in the book, I discovered from a retired physician, actually, that when the heart starts to form in the womb, one of the first things to grow literally off the sides of the heart are the arms. They're known as arm buds. They're like fledgling wings. And so the arms, the hands, are directly grow out of the heart. So, this is what it means to be embodied, that what starts in the heart ends in the hands. And the word authentic, which comes from the Greek, means the mark of the hands. The mark of the hands. So what starts in the heart lands in the world. And what we touch in the world lands in the heart. And by staying committed to this practice of allowing what we feel to land as touch, and what we touch to land in our heart, this is how we find the wisdom that waits in our heart.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I can relate a lot to it. I am also a heart math trainer, so I love the intelligence of the heart, and basically what you're also saying in the book is basically what you don't know, and what you just said, with the gay rights or the gay. What you haven't experienced is basically what you don't know yet. You don't know until you experience it. Then it becomes something of yourself, and then you truly start to know it, to know what it feels like.
Yes, and just as we have lungs, but unless we breathe, we don't take air in.
Yeah.
And we don't inhale and exhale. So we have the capacity. We have our lungs, but unless we use them, we don't know what it is to breathe. And it's the same thing with the heart. We have this magnificent, I believe the heart is the strongest muscle we have. This magical, mysterious muscle that no matter which interestingly, when it's most sensitive is when it's its most finely tuned instrument. And of course that sensitivity at times is very difficult to bear. But that's an indication that we're so alive. But we have this magnificent heart, and unless we love, unless we touch, unless we let what we feel reach us and come through us, then like the lungs, if we don't breathe, we're not alive. Unless we don't know compassion, unless we let that what we feel come through us. And this is another amazing example that we need to both be and become. Be and become. So as we and I think this is a lesson of embodied compassion, is that whatever it is we experience, the heart opens and can't close that part of it again. Yeah. So I'm a long-term cancer survivor, and having been through almost dying and still being here, I've experienced a range of suffering that my heart can never close to the suffering of others again. Not just because I'm altruistic, I'm compassionate, because no, there's a spiritual physics involved. Years ago when I was in my late 20s or early 30s, and I was very active and never really up until this is before my cancer experience, but I twinged my back exercising or something, and until that time I was like, for about 10 days I could hardly move, until it healed. Well, I remember at that time I would go to the grocery store before this, and there'd be an old woman in the grocery line, hardly taking her 10 minutes to walk through the line and get out the door, and everybody, including me, was impatient with her. Nobody said anything, and why is it taking her so long? Well, after I hurt my back, I knew.
Yeah.
And then the next time I saw her in line, I helped her with her groceries.
Yeah.
I didn't just stand and wonder why she took so long. And this is what I mean. Once we feel something directly, then once the heart is opened, that part of the heart can never be closed again.
Yeah.
And this is what joins us, and this is where the Hindus say, "Thou art that." We are each other. We are each other. Once the heart is hollowed out, then everybody lives there.
Yeah, no, it's so true, and I so strongly feel the same. And that's basically what you talk about, the chisel and doing the woodworks. Life starts shaping us, and we begin to understand, and we begin to feel that. We've been speaking about like the balance, about the wisdom in our heart from our soul, but I would actually like to touch a little bit upon the desires of our soul and the urge of our will, what you also have been describing in a beautiful chapter where your dad has had an immense love for sailing, and you describe some beautiful analogies about sailing through life. You write, we usually think about where we're going instead of listening where life is taking us. So how do we find like a healthy balance between the desires of our soul and the urge of our will?
Well, I think this brings up, and then we'll talk more specifically about the will and the grace that fills our sail. But this brings up, and which I talk about in the book too, that I think every one of us is called to develop a personal practice of return. That is, I don't believe in a permanent state of enlightenment. At least that's not been my experience on earth. And that this messy and mysterious and magnificent incarnation of being human is where it all is. And so in that, we fall down and we get up, which is how medieval monks would talk about their faith. When asked how they practiced their faith, they'd say, by falling down and getting up. I love that. Yeah. And so we too, I remember one of the things as a boy, my father would... he entrusted me with the tiller to steer the boat through a fog. We had a compass. And I learned very early as a young boy that, a compass, when you're going whatever direction you're heading, it never stays exactly still. The needle on that compass is constantly drifting a little to the left, a little to the right. So you have to constantly bring it back to center. You have to practice return. And this, to me, is a great metaphor for the practice of being human, of how to be a spirit in a body in time on earth. We aim, we say, I want to have a balance between my will and listening to where life is taking me. And doing everything you can, it will never be 100% on course. The purpose of the will is to steer back to center. And so this brings us to, what this whole... And again, my father never spoke in these terms. It's all these years later that I'm retrieving the lessons from what his love of the sea. And so, he built a 30-foot sailboat that I spent a lot of my youth on. And it was a catch. And so we would, on Long Island, we would cross the Great South Bay back and forth, go to the Long Island Sound sometimes. And he was the one who said, it's the sail, it's the wind filling the sail that directs the boat. And once the wind tells you where the boat is going, it's steering it that follows the wind. And so all these years later, I was teaching somewhere, and someone asked me about the difference between the will, the soul, and the ego. Mm-hmm. And that's when I all of a sudden recalled this from my father and saw it now in terms of, so the sail is like, it's our spirit, and when it's filled with the spirit of life, it fills us and steers us in a direction, and now the will can help us get there. And it's a fine tuning between insisting on where we're going, and so that, there's a fine line between determination and stubbornness. And right, it can, in a second, I can be even nobly, earnestly determined, and all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, it's tripped over, and the compass of my life has gone too far this way, and now it's stubbornness. How did it happen? Well, I can figure out how it happened, but right now I got to steer back so that I'm more determined and less stubborn. Yeah. That's the purpose of the will. The purpose of the will is that I will, be sensitive one day. We all have those days when we're so in tune that if we're having tea and you start to knock the tea off the table, I'm in tune enough that day to catch the cup before it hits the ground. Yeah. And if we have tea tomorrow, I'll spill it on you. And so this personal practice of return, when we inadvertently hurt each other, how to be sensitive and caring. When we get numb, how to awake. When we get stubborn, how to move it back to be determined and earnest. When we get fixed in our ideas, how to drop what we know and say, I don't know anything. This is I have a poem that I don't have it right here, but it's a short poem, and basically it says, if you want to have a true friend, admit you don't know anything. Yeah. Just admit you don't know anything and give them the chance to admit they don't know anything, and then you can truly begin. Yeah. Then you can truly begin a friendship.
It's so true, and I also love the analogy with the compass, and we have a certain might have set our will, might have set a certain course, certain direction. I was doing this morning, I was training somebody on heart math, and as you know, we said our heart rate is 60 beats per minute, but of course you and I know is that our heart rate goes up, and it goes down, and it goes up. And the average between the highs and the lows might be 60, but it might be 70, it might be 50. But the difference between those, and I had to think about the compass, the differences, the variation, that determines our resilience. That's what our heart teaches us. That's our resilience. And I had to think about it. I thought, that's beautiful, we can see it that way.
And this is why we need a practice of return. And part of that practice is to practice. So for instance, breathing deeply, meditating in any way will bring a stressed heartbeat down. Well, it's great to practice that when you're not stressed, so that when you are, you can practice it when you're out on the street, when you're in an emotional, challenging situation. Yeah. And this is, I have in one of my other books, and this was a great lesson from the great composer Beethoven. Mm-hmm. And what I love about Beethoven is that I like to think of Beethoven as this extraordinary talent carried by a very ordinary person. Yeah. And that's what is so heroic about Beethoven to me. So in one of the things, he was a great innovator. And one of the things he did in making string quartets, for chamber music. Mm-hmm. And traditionally, string quartets are 4 movements. So Beethoven wrote one that was 7 movements. And all the musicians of the time, they had a love-hate relationship with Beethoven because they couldn't wait to see what he would create. And then they'd go, how are we supposed to play 7? And then they'd say, well, let's try. And so this is Opus 131. It's called the Last Quartet, it's known as. The other thing he did in this quartet is in music, in the language of music, there are rest stops.
Mm-hmm.
And those are pauses. And now for professional string musicians, they're capable of, in those brief rest stops, of retuning their instruments, because you can't play 4 movements without your strings going out of tune. Well, Beethoven not only wrote 7 movements, no rest stops in the entire string quartet. And he was saying to the musicians, I know, you will not be able to keep your instruments in tune, and you're going to have to see what music you can make with what you have and tune as you go. And this is a great lesson about life. Not that we shouldn't go on retreats and have practices and meditate and do things, but it's all so that we have to tune as we go, with the one life we're given.
Yeah.
And magically, when we do, we don't do it perfectly. We don't do it always gracefully.
Mm-hmm.
But the original definition of the word perfect was not without flaws or mistakes. It was thorough. We do it thoroughly.
Yeah.
And it's doing it thoroughly that releases the wisdom that waits in our heart.
Yeah. And then I could even say that, at least that's how I look at it, then every moment is basically perfect, whatever your definition is.
Yes, because being thorough helps us stay wholehearted. And, being human, we slip into being half-hearted. And it's when in our half-heartedness that we become stubborn and opinionated and prejudiced and fearful. Now, you can't eliminate all of that, but where is it that we really reside? Yeah. Am I wholehearted and I slip out of it into being half-hearted, or am I living half-hearted all the time? This is what are we going to do with the one life we're given? Where are we going to believe and stand with our heart?
So if you would sum it up, what would be the 3 most valuable lessons or insights that life has taught you?
Well, let me speak to it. I don't know if I can sum it all up, but I think the first thing is that none of this should we ever take the precious fact that we're here for granted. And when I can recover that how rare it is to be here at all, I am brought back to being wholehearted. And once I'm wholehearted, I see with different eyes, I hear with different ears. There's less between me and the world. Now I have a better chance of living a full life. And so being in that kind of place, when I can return to how rare it is to be here, I think the second thing is to hold nothing back. To hold nothing back. That it doesn't mean I'm wild. That means that I am present in all directions. The sun emanates light and warmth in all directions without preference. Now in the surface world, I have to make choices. I had to make sure I got home so we could be on this interview together at the right time, and I have to fill up the car, and I have to buy food, and we have to make 1,000 choices. But inwardly, our heart is like the sun inside. It emanates light and warmth in all directions without preference. And that is a vow I need to keep in order to hold nothing back and live fully in the world. And I think if there's a third thing, it's to humbly be open to and accept that everyone and everything I meet is my teacher. Everything.
Yeah, That's really, really beautiful. And if you live, and I have the feeling following you a bit, of course, and talking to you now, is that you seem to master these three elements pretty well, and it's the same time, it's not something that you are so great and you know it all and you do it that way, but especially the points that you mentioned also shows your own vulnerability, your own flaws, if you might say so, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
That whole blend makes life, of course, a very interesting journey.
And we need all of our feelings and all of our flaws and all of our every aspect of being human is how we release heaven here on earth. We need it all.
Yeah, yeah, we do. And you were mentioning the wholeheartedness. To me, that is the purest expression of love. That's how I see life as love. But I was wondering, and it's actually my last question for you. I ask them many people because I'm always very fascinated by that. What does love really mean to you?
Well, I think love is the force that connects everything, and it comes through every living thing. And many of the things in nature, they can't help but have that force of life come through them. We, having special gifts, yeah, we can have it come through us, but we can also stop it.
Hmm.
And this is where we need to continually learn from all the other forms of life. You know, plants and of all kinds, trees, plants, flowers, they grow toward the light. Nothing will stop them from growing toward the light. You know, and that's the force of love. And I believe that that force connects the the peace of the universe of God that we carry within us with with everything that's all around us.
Yeah.
We as living human beings are the conduits between the inner world and the outer world. And it's love that connects, that constantly connects the two.
Beautiful. Yeah, I can very much relate to that. So that's very beautiful. Thank you for that. And Mark, yeah, I could talk all day with you because there's so much wisdom and there's such a beautiful connection. I just wanted to get a little bit of give you a feel as a reader. You know, the one life that we're given, Mark's latest book, finding the wisdom that waits in your heart. I would definitely pick up a copy because it's what I'm saying. It's not just a book. It's something that you would want to hold on to and read over again. And while I was reading it, Mark, I had at least four people were coming up. I said, "Ah, as soon as I can get a copy of your book, I have to give those people a copy
Oh,
because
thank
you
you.
know it is so there's so much wisdom in there that you can apply that in so many different situations in our life. So thank you so much for sharing the wisdom and all that you have learned along your path. And I'm so grateful also in speaking with you and also helping you to share your message.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for the work, the good work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Mark. Bye for now.
All right. Bye bye.